Good morning, everybody. My name is Dimitra Hartas, and I'm from the University of Warwick. I'm delighted to be joining you today to discuss a study that I did some years ago on young people's educational aspirations uh, by drawing data from Understanding Society. Increasing educational aspirations has been very much at the heart of UK education policy for nearly 2 decades now. Creating aspirant citizens and children is seen as a solution to the growing social inequality and a solution to increase social mobility as well as maximize children's life chances. The assumption has always been that aspirations, especially among young people and families who experience socioeconomic disadvantage, are low. And also that there is a direct link between educational aspirations and academic achievement, and that this link is certainly very direct and unmediated by the circumstances that surround young people's lives. The study chose to look into educational aspirations through the prism of psychosocial factors and familial factors. Now, these were examined along home environment, and by home environment, I mean lots of things here. Parental involvement in children's learning, the cultural capital and cultural resources in the family, emotional closeness between parents and children, sibling relationships, as well as intellectual interactions within the family. And also by looking at young people's social behavior, well-being, self-efficacy, as well as relationships with peers. The reason for looking into both psychosocial and familial factors is an attempt to place aspiration within the wider social context of children's lives. It's looking at family as well as social relationships and cultural resources, but also looking into young people's personal agency and asking the questions, are there certain psychosocial and familial factors more influential than others in predicting young people's educational aspirations? And are there any differences in terms of gender and age? If we look at research, most research on educational aspirations has been examined through socioeconomic lenses, through family income, parent education, parent occupational status. But at the same time, there are notions of cultural capital that have entered conversations about inequality and the reproduction of the social disadvantage. So, an American sociologist, Annette Lareau, has coined a specific term, the term of concerted cultivation, in order to explain mostly middle class parent practices to support their children's learning and maximizing opportunities for them, educational opportunities as well as career opportunities. So I will be referring to this term in my study, but also another useful term has been coined by Archer and colleagues, that of family habitus. Looking at family not just as a learning environment, but as a more an interconnected web of social, intellectual, and cultural experiences for both parents and children. By bringing them together, we will be able to try to see educational aspirations through different lenses. What do I mean by psychosocial factors in this study? I'm talking about measures of young people self-beliefs, self-efficacy, well-being, relationships with significant others, be it parents or peers, siblings, and try to understand how this is likely to influence their educational aspirations. But also, I would like to look into to account for individuals' personal agency and personal dispositions, the people's attributes and capabilities, and how they're likely these to affect educational aspirations. The sample that I got here was from the general population sample, which was completed in wave 2 and wave 3 of Understanding Society, that is 2010, 2012. And I did focus only on the youth self-completion questionnaire, which asked 10 to 15-year-olds to complete a questionnaire on issues such as technology use, social behavior, interaction with peers, sibling relationships, behavior measures, and well-being, as well as educational aspirations. To be more precise, measures of psychosocial factors involve general well-being questions. So 10 to 15-year-olds were asked about, how do you feel about yourself? How do you feel about your life as a whole type of questions. There were questions about self-efficacy beliefs. For example, I'm able, or excuse me, I'm as able as most people. At times I feel I'm no good at all. There are also questions about peer relationships, focusing on bullying in particular, whether or not they're being physically or verbally bullied by other children at school. And questions about behavior. It is the SDQ that is used, which consists of items to capture both externalizing and internalizing behavioral difficulties, as well as prosocial behavior and cooperative behavior. The home environment measures include I would say 3 clusters here. The first one is more about parent, family, child, affective and emotional relationships. So it's about whether they feel emotionally close to their parents, whether they argue with parents. There is also sibling rivalries, how they relate to their siblings. But also measures of what I would call family's cultural capital, and in terms of whether there's family participation in cultural activities, such as going to visiting a library, visiting a museum, or art galleries, whether there is a discussion of books at home, as well as about conversations about politics and other topical matters. And another cluster would be more sort of direct school support parents provide through either supporting children to participate in extracurricular activities outside the school, or more directly homework support. Educational aspirations were understood in this context as asking 10 to 15-year-olds about the perceptions of the importance of GCSE outcomes, asking them about post-16 choices in terms of whether they plan to stay full-time education or full-time employment, training and apprenticeship, and also whether they whether they plan to pursue higher education. So we do have this sort of measures of educational aspiration. I suppose what, in a nutshell, what the key findings of this study are, first of all, that young people's general well-being as well as self-efficacy predicted their educational aspirations. Nothing surprising in that. That means that as well-being and self-efficacy increased, young people were more likely to consider GCSEs as being important, as well as aspiring to higher education. There were some interesting sort of findings with respect to age and gender, in that pre-adolescents as well as boys emerged as being less aspiring than mid-adolescents and girls. Also, in terms of emotional connectedness and closeness, that emerged as a significant predictor, particularly with young people's views on the importance of GCSEs, but not so much with regard to aspiring to higher education. And what I found an interesting finding is that extracurricular activities and homework support and parental participation in children's learning did not emerge as a significant predictor in this study. It didn't predict educational aspirations. In contrast, what seemed to predict educational aspirations was cultural capital. I would like to stay a little bit more on this, especially the last finding, is that kind of raises some interesting questions about what seems to be, what parental support and parental involvement actually mean. And it seems that parental influence on children's and teenagers' educational aspirations is more subtle than what has been originally thought about. So it doesn't seem to be manifested so much through direct support with homework or private tutoring or extracurricular activities, but it seems to be manifested more in the form of intellectual pursuits and cultural pursuits within the family, and engagement in cultural activities. So it seems to me that what we see here is that the home environment emerges as a family habitus concept, not just something that focuses on school-driven academic performance, but something that encourages more sort of intellectual explorations and conversations about culture, about books, about politics, that are likely to predict young people's aspirations. So it kind of points to the importance of a wider culture of learning at home as being important. So a culture where there is a lot of emphasis on parent-teenage interactions that are emotionally and intellectually charged, rather than just responding to school demands. So it seems here that that kind of, if we think about policy, educational policy, there has been so much emphasis placed on the importance of parent learning support in terms of increasing children's aspirations. And again, it seems to be seen as a sort of the link between parental learning support and educational aspirations has been very direct and causal. From what we gather here, the question is, does more school-driven parental learning support make teenagers more aspirant or more likely to stay in education post-16? Not so much, according to the results of the study. However, what does that mean in terms of concerted cultivation? It seems that the results suggest a distinction needs to be made when we're talking about the concept of concerted cultivation. And that we need to differentiate sort of cultural capital and its manifestation in cultural activities and intellectual pursuits in family from school-driven parental involvement with learning. And thus it seems that what the findings suggest is that less instrumental family interactions actually seem to be more likely to support teenage aspirations, educational aspirations. So wider culture of learning and less instrumental forms of engaging with teenagers may be more important to them in terms of aspiring to higher education. As I already mentioned, personal agency and measures of personal agency also play a significant role. And that's people's dispositions in terms of well-being, a sense of well-being, self-efficacy, seem to associate with perceiving GCSE outcomes as being important. And thus it does make sense, because beliefs about themselves as learners are likely to influence teenagers' courses of action. It is likely to influence the resilience that may show when they face adversity and trying to cope with external difficulties. And thus they do play an important role. But also behavior, social behavior, and how the teenagers interact with the peers is also an important factor when examining educational aspirations. It's not surprising that teenagers with higher self-ratings of behavioral difficulties, is called hyperactivity, reduced capacity to self-regulate, are likely to contribute to educational aspirations in a negative manner. And in this study, it showed that these sort of difficulties were likely, for children with these sort of difficulties, were likely to choose, they were less likely to choose post-16 education and possibly seeing GCSEs as, the end of the educational career. It was interesting that also bullying was found to associate with not considering GCSEs as being important. But it did not predict aspirations for higher or further education post-16. So it seems that the insidious effect of bullying probably are more keenly felt by teenagers around the notion of GCSEs more than affecting what they plan to do in the future, long term. What was also interesting was the sort of the gender and age differences that emerged. Certainly, pre-adolescent children were less aspiring, and possibly that's because as the children move from pre-adolescent to mid-adolescence, I suppose they become more realistic about possible educational trajectories. They become more aware of what is possible for them. And that awareness is likely to trigger educational aspirations. But also that kind of raises the importance of tackling early school leaving, because early school leaving means that probably teenagers wouldn't have the chance to become aware of what is possible ahead of them, and thus aspire to higher education. But the gender differences are also quite interesting in that it seems that girls place more value in education, especially higher education, than boys. And that is quite consistent with trends that we see in terms of university graduation, in that girls being percentage of girls graduating being higher than that of boys. So I mean, some theorists have looked into the gender differences in terms of educational aspirations and have interpreted in terms of girls and young women accepting a social hierarchy that seems to be based more on education and intellectual pursuits, whereas boys are more likely to accept an economic hierarchy. Um, uh, Possibly, but also girls may see more of worth and more stability in education. Um, but something more important that I felt came out from this study was about aspiration poverty. I mean, there's been lots in public discourses, policy discourses of aspiration poverty. And really, the findings suggest that actually there is no aspiration poverty. There is no shortage of aspiration among young people and teenagers. In this study, around 3/4 aspire to pursue further education and higher education. But also, I would like to add that there is no shortage in aspiration among parents. In a previous study that I did by utilizing a data set from the Millennium Cohort study, a staggering 97% of parents reported that they would like their children to pursue higher education. Certainly there is no shortage. However, there is a disconnect here between people's and young people's and their parents' desire to pursue higher education and stay post 16 in education, and the possibilities and the opportunities that are available to them, so their aspirations can be materialized. Um, I suppose the question is, what does this mean for our pandemic world and a post-COVID world? It kind of highlights the limits of aspiration as an individual trait, and highlighting the importance of looking into aspirations within the social context, within the structural affordances and constraints of young people's life, but also accounting for personal and individual agency and social relationships. Um, um, but also to stress that aspiration alone is not sufficient to affect social change. Aspiration is high. How do we translate it into viable educational and trajectories and career choices, however, is a different question altogether, and one that is of primary importance to be discussed and understood and for things to happen. But also, the study sort of highlighted the importance of family environments, not just as home learning environments, but as a family habitus, as sort of an interconnected sort of web of emotional, intellectual, and social experiences that set the stage for young people's aspirations. So in a sense, family environment should be more than just a home learning environment, should be seen as a complex system of interactions and lived experiences. Um, uh, Whether that is feasible now, that's a good question, because it seems that in our COVID world, the sort of that notion of family habitus has been very much reduced to parents struggling to respond to the children's school needs, let alone engage in other cultural or intellectual pursuits. So it is that the world, that the family environment, the family world is being more and more and more reduced. And the onus has been placed more on parents to respond to the children's educational needs. And not only that, but also reverse the achievement gap, and ensure that they're capable of maximizing their children's life chances. So I think these are big questions to be explored, and I'm happy to go back to Raj now and engage with you a little bit later on with the Q&A session. Thank you very much.